Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a few minutes, really, to speak, and of course, when we're talking about the Civil War, it seems like placing a very big cork in a very small bottle. So let me just leave two things with you that I want to share. Can you hear me? As Steve mentioned to you before, I've been working on a series of portraits of Minnesotans who played a very important role in suffrage in Minnesota. Minnesota was the first place to pass a suffrage bill extending the right to vote to African Americans. It was the first state in the Union, really, for that to happen by popular vote. And you know, I was interested in what happened to them before and after. What kinds of people were these who led that particular movement? Since I wrote to Steve, I had decided to add one more profile to my research, and that would be William R. Marshall, who was Montgomery's commander during the Dakota War and during, at least for a short time, as his unit deployed to St. Louis. I think that Montgomery reserves a lot more time than we have here, because he is in some ways quite complex, but he's also quite simple in his complexity. He is very much reflective of the time. I saw in his letters a person who had very little, well, had no experience really of African Americans, and was confronted with them the first time he went to St. Louis. And that his motives for joining the United States Colored Infantry, which is one thing that makes him really noteworthy. He left the 7th Infantry to become a lieutenant in the Colored Infantry. The motivation for joining the Colored Infantry in 1863 is interesting. I don't know at this point to what extent his life reflects the attitudes of other soldiers, white soldiers, who decided to join the Colored Infantry and to lead those units. And there are many interesting pieces connected with what happened and how the federal government insisted that these particular soldiers have a certain quality. They had to be tested in order to qualify to lead colored troops. And this is something that wasn't necessarily required of officers in leading white troops. That's an interesting statement about federal policy. But setting that aside, one of the things that I noticed about Montgomery was that when he looked at his African American troops, he was impressed. He believed in emancipation, clearly, but as the months began to pass and his unit was deployed further south into the lower Mississippi River Valley, where there were increasing incidences of illness, huge numbers of black troopers dying from cholera, smallpox, yellow fever. It was interesting to look at his observation, Montgomery's observation of his men. And of course, being a person with no experience with African Americans, he concluded what perhaps a number of whites felt about blacks at this time in these similar conditions, namely that there was something inherently inferior about them. Now, he himself was grappling with various symptoms, but it would be through that trial of understanding the high mortality rate that would begin to mold him in terms of getting a deeper sense of what African Americans had been susceptible to and what kinds of the kind of experience that they were having that was unique to his own. He would later come out in 1865. He was still in service. And one man who he absolutely revered commanded his unit, as I said before, during the Dakota War, and that was later become governor of Minnesota, William Marshall. And when Marshall ran for governor in 1865, Montgomery, whose unit was still in occupation, they were still occupying the southern Mississippi River Valley, spoke very highly of Marshall. but was questionable, was questioning the validity of having a black suffrage bill. So in subsequent letters, it's interesting to see how he would begin to change his attitudes about that particular thing. Indeed, his own particular county voted against it twice before, and it would take 3 efforts before that vote would be passed. I think the most important thing I want to share with you, though, looks at Montgomery's experience in a much more larger sense. Yesterday, I was meeting with my class. I teach a course in 19th century history, and we are talking about the Civil War at this time. And we are in 1863, and I asked my students to consider this. Now, shift focus from Montgomery to the big boss, President Lincoln. And I asked students, let's count the various challenges that the president faced during this time. Okay, number 1, he's trying to wage war and keep the Union together. Okay, that's an easy one to see. But the second challenge is the fact that a growing number of Americans, Northerners, principally New York, but not exclusively New York, are growing weary of this war that seemed to never end. If the Southerners want to leave, let them go. And besides, this war continues to be bad for business. Plus, so you have a campaign forming in northern states debating the issue of seceding from the Union while the Union is at war with the South. That's the second issue that Lincoln dealt with. The third issue is an increase of immigration, which was at once welcome and people were skeptical of it. Immigrants flooding in, especially in places like Minnesota. It was critical because so many of the farmers had gone to war. We need somebody to work. So many of the farmers, so many of the laborers had gone to war. We needed someone to work. And that was one practical reason for inviting or accepting the immigration of foreigners. Many of whom had mixed feelings about the war itself. This is the third thing. The tensions between the Irish Catholics, for example, and the African American legend. Much has been written about that tension. Much has been filmed about that tension. And what it comes down to, and it's not a simple issue, is that you had two peoples who were desperate for unskilled labor. It becomes an issue of survival. In 1863, you see the bias, the anti-black sensibility existing in many of the immigrant communities, especially those immigrant communities existing in the big cities. And in the largest cities in particular, you see even more intense anti-black sensibility. What happens in 63? January, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is a moral document and it is a document of military necessity because by 1863, the romance of war has worn off. And so in a sense, the Emancipation Proclamation is intended to provide a rear guard against the Confederates, possibly even inspire them to join the ranks to free up white troopers to do the hard work of fighting so that the black troopers who come in do the grunt work. This may have been the situation, but by March of 1863, we're talking about a draft. This is yet another challenge that the president faces. All of this suggests that President Lincoln is dealing with a ground that's quickly eroding beneath his feet. 1863. We know how the war ends. We know who ultimately are the good guys and the bad guys, at least in a historical perspective. But in 1863, I wanted my students to consider the challenges that President Lincoln faced in continuing to wage this war with a concept of keeping the nation united. Let's add one more element to this point. Even though we characterize the South as states' rights and the North enhanced, believing, supporting, embracing the notion of a strong national government, that was not a natural and inevitable feeling among Northerners. States' rights was nationwide. And indeed, by the time we get to war, many Northerners, Minnesotans in particular, view the federal government as the plaything of another region, that we wish to be left alone. We recognize there may be some things that the federal government can do, but for all intents and purposes, we don't trust the people who are making decisions for us in Washington, because their interests are not our own. It's a very interesting kind of twist of where we are today. So I asked my students to consider this additional thing. While he's trying to keep the country together, he's trying to keep the country together. And by that I mean he's trying to transform people who had seen themselves as states people, as local government people, in a larger construct. So finally I asked students, tell me, how can a nation made up of so many people who were skeptical of their neighbors, who felt besieged by a foreign presence, who didn't understand federal policy that had them fighting a foreign war, which is how many Northerners viewed the South, over the issue of freeing people who threatened their welfare, how could you keep a war going like this? And to do so with the style that Lincoln seemed to embody. And the students began to scratch their head. It was one of those special moments when a teacher is gratified. Students are listening and thinking. I said, furthermore, it would be easy for these people, for America, Northerners in particular, to say, okay, slavery is obnoxious to the concept of what America is about. And many Northerners felt this way. Many soldiers felt this way. But it was an abstraction. It was an abstract thought because African Americans weren't in their lives when they were at home. So how do you get people to take a step that could ultimately change their lives forever? How could you get people to unify behind a struggle that would, in effect, open up their worst expectations? You free blacks, they flood to the north, because who wants to stay in a place with all those bad memories? Slavery. How could you get people to embrace a motive in which people have to look at each other in a different way? How do you do that while waging a war? And they scratch their heads again. Well, when I teach, I've learned that the best way to get at these big issues is to get small, is to get concrete. When one begins to get tempted to deal with abstract notions, grandiose platitudes, the key thing is to get small and concrete. At least this is what's worked for me. So what we talked about was not so much a speech that Lincoln delivered, as much as that moment when Montgomery and his unit first arrived at Port Hudson, Louisiana. Now, what's Port Hudson? All of us here are familiar with Vicksburg. Vicksburg's a fortress on the Mississippi River that essentially controlled the southern half of the Mississippi River, denying the Union of being able to use that river from the top to the bottom. But Port Hudson was also a fortress situated in Louisiana. So in effect, it was the additional knot in the road that had to be taken. Port Hudson was a target, 1863, I believe. The battle began. It took much longer than it was expected, and because of the fortification, Union troops were decimated. Compound the fact that the fortification was situated in a swamp. Anybody attempting to breach the walls would be stuck in mud, and indeed many soldiers were stuck and were just targets. At that particular time, an officer in charge of the Corps d'Afrique, which was the African Corps, made up of African Americans from New Orleans and surrounding parts. Some of them were free blacks. Others were former slaves. Many of them were Creoles. That's my home, by the way, so I especially took notice of this particular episode. We're doing what most African American troops had been assigned to doing, and that is digging trenches, doing custodial work, teamster work, the grunt work. And that is in part because few people in the military, in the nation, but in the military before, and specifically, felt that African Americans could be relied upon to fight. This officer says, we can take it. A black man, one of the few black officers in the Army, Callio's his name, good Creole name. And he says this in French, first language for a number of Creoles in Louisiana at this particular time. And he directed his unit, he led his unit actually, into the killing fields of Port Hudson. And his troops, who weren't all armed, many of them only had picks and shovels to carry into battle. They weren't prepared for this. They weren't trained for this kind of assault, but they attacked anyway. And they were decimated. Now, the point that I'm trying to characterize here is what the observer saw. And there are a number of letters from white officers who saw the assault. I'm thinking about Fort Wagner, of course, Glory, the movie, the Massachusetts 54th. This is happening at Port Wagner. And even more so was the sense that these are guys who are unarmed, who felt a sense of duty to head up the hill. This was the thing that was most important. Commanders, junior officers, enlisted men who saw the assault and saw the renewed assault and the renewed assault, took note of this and wrote home. The New York Times picked up on this story. Northern newspapers picked up on this story. And for the first time, really, this was the first time when people had a sense, because the writers then were very good and very colorful. The voters at home, Americans and in particular Northerners, had a sense of the character of the African American. I think that it is an experience like that that transformed people who were otherwise ambivalent. That there's something about war in this particular context. There's something about the tragedy of that moment in this particular context that changed the nation forever. I think that especially at a time when soldiers came back, there were soldiers who, Minnesota also was, they passed a law that allowed soldiers to be able to vote, a very controversial thing. These kinds of things, this memory seared in the minds of troopers who may have abstractly ambivalent notions about the African American as an equal, but having a visceral reaction to him as a person of character and a person deserving freedom. I think these kinds of experiences transform people. Finally, and I know we don't have any time, and I actually would like to see the person who's going to speak next, and thanks, Steve, for making that happen. I believe that people really are two people embodied in one. I think that this is an example that underscores the notion that most of us are guided by our higher selves, but especially during a time when it's not being tested. That it is possible to think higher about what society needs and who people are and things of this nature. They have lofty views of how society should be, but when we're not really challenged with it, when we're not confronted with it, we can be somewhat complacent. We can let things pass. We can continue on with our own biases. Here comes Steve. It takes a graphic moment, a dramatic moment like this sometimes to really drill in what the idea really means in a concrete sense. So with that,
want to take a couple questions?
Sure, I'll take a couple questions, yes. Yes, sir.
Bill, would you come back next year and speak about Southern peonage, how the Confederacy won the war?
How they won the war?
After 1876 to about 1941.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that is not that issue specifically, but the concept of the spirit of emancipation, of the 14th and 15th Amendments, all of that begins to dissipate by 1875. And America seems to become complacent to the whole principle of equality, civil rights for the African American, and that is a very important story to understand. And in fact, that is the motivation behind this manuscript of these profiles.
Professor David Blight, he advised me a couple weeks ago to read about it in the morning, because at night when I read about it, I can't get to sleep.
Yeah.
I get so upset.
Yeah. In looking at these personalities, I was trying to get their story. I know what historians say about how the Republican Party, the patron of suffrage and freedom and emancipation, distracted, became less the party of reform and more the party of private enterprise, and how what that meant was that African Americans were abandoned to...
Rutherford B. Hayes?
Yeah. Yes.
Bill, you got a question on the far left.
Sure. Far left? Okay. Who's left? Mine or you?
My question is really, you talked about the Irish Catholics worrying about the blacks coming up and taking their jobs and stuff.
Right.
Would the expansion to the west have taken the pressure off of that?
I don't think so, because, I mean, historians oftentimes talk about the West as a vent, as a way of venting off the steam. They talked about it prior to the Civil War, but there were not a lot of opportunities in the West. People would go out in the West and find that they can't survive. The ground was hard, you know, windstorms, grasshopper infestation. It was a very difficult place to actually sustain a genuine livelihood, and that word had gone back to the East, so that while there's a romance about the West, most Americans stayed east of the Mississippi. Now, of course, you know, people did take chances, and they did survive. They did succeed in some instances, but typically that was not something that was not really viewed as an option for what for me was a surprising number of Americans. So the tensions, the class tensions that exist prior to the Civil War survived the Civil War, even though some of the people had gone through what they had gone through. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.